Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization, and we run the Iowa City Book Festival each year, and you are privileged to be at the first event on the schedule. So we have more than 50 throughout the course of the next 4 days, so you won't be able to make them all because we have a lot of them that are concurrent, but hopefully you can make it to quite a few. It's quite a schedule. So I just wanted to start out and thank some of the sponsors who make the festival possible. Obviously, the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, and the Iowa Arts Council are our main sponsors. We also have support from the Sheraton of Iowa City, the Iowa City Public Library, who not only provide financial support, but house many of our events throughout the course of the weekend. The Iowa City Coralville Convention and Visitors Bureau, Bradley and Riley PC, Knutson and Construction, Film Scene, and the Iowa Review. So a lot of hands help to make this possible. So today we will hear from Aron Aji on the topic of how books travel, literary translation and international writing. Aron is the director of the MFA in Literary Translation at the University of Iowa. He is a native of Turkey and has translated works by several Turkish writers. He leads the translation workshop here and teaches courses on retranslation, poetry and translation, theory, and contemporary Turkish literature. He is also vice president of the American Literary Translators Association. So please help me welcome Aron to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I just thought that as we were waiting, I had the program website for you to take a look at. We are certainly a proud partner, if you will, of the Iowa City of Literature, and also the Iowa City as the creative arts center, really, of the country, if not the nation. I was just talking about this earlier. Wherever you go in the world, when they hear Iowa, they immediately ask about the Writers' Workshop and the creative arts that we are known for. And for 50 years now, translation has been part of that landscape, beginning with an Iowa translation workshop, and then now with the MFA in Literary Translation, which itself is about 40 years old. So it's an old program, and in fact, we are also very much responsible for training a good number of literary translators that then go on to contributing to this travel of books across borders and countries. You may have noticed the last 2 years winners of the Best Translated Book Award for Poetry were our alum, both of them. Of course, we're not going to have that every year, but I thought it was nice to put it there. So what I would like to do today is give you a very quick survey of sort of the global networks across which books travel, how literature is created and how it travels, obviously, what gets translated, why, the glass half empty or half full, the what and how of literary translation, how languages experience each other, and examples from my own practice. Now, above all, what I would really like is to encourage engaged and advocate readership of literature in translation. Oftentimes, international writing is not showcased, is not foregrounded. And in fact, you probably know that many translated books do not even have their translator's name on the cover. It's as if something we have to somehow hide. And yet, there are some very important developments in terms of the world we live in right now that really make translation critical. About 90% of information shared across the globe comes to us through translation, either from English to other languages or from other languages to English. This is sort of the global reality, if you will. We have obviously exchange of goods, capital, and human beings, but also obviously exchange of information and knowledge. We have 250 million people who live in parts of the world that aren't where they were born in. So, and that comes to about 5th largest population mass, if you will, if you were to compare them to countries. And that, of course, what it does is it creates networks through which languages travel. Yesterday at the translation workshop, a student is translating a piece written by a Peruvian Okinawan, not even Japanese, Peruvian Okinawan. And the whole piece is about how languages, in fact, negotiate this hybrid space. And we often think about globalization as an American phenomenon, but it is really not as clear-cut as that. It is true that capitalism has a very strong role to play in globalization and global networks. However, we have the development of multiple geopolitical or economic networks. As you know, European Union, for example, is one such. But even if one were not to look at the European Union, you would still be thinking about the kind of networks that were created during the colonial period. So you have languages that in fact now still enjoy quite a network of cultures interacting through those languages. But also, interestingly, the more we are becoming global, the more it seems we're becoming interested in different cultures and different languages. Today, there is a greater awareness of languages and, of course, the dying languages as well. There are about 6,000 languages that are spoken in the world. Obviously, about 200 to 300 of them are viable languages. Others are smaller ethnic communities or tribal communities, small enclaves. So we are much more aware of the difference and diversity, the human diversity, if you will, of our world. And we also have coexistence and synergy that is developing on account of these networks. And you would, in fact, be very surprised to find that even among enemies, there are, in fact, sustained relationships. I believe that the literary community never embargoed Cuba. The literary community never embargoed Iran. And in fact, these are sort of ways in which we have sort of cultivated what Chris Merrill likes to call cultural diplomacy. And that is, of course, another very important highway through which language, literature, and translation travel. So there is a sense of a border, and there is a sense of movement. Wherever you are, whether you are in Turkey or in the United States, there is the emergence of some kind of a global outlook in literature. Because of our awareness of each other, perhaps, but also because the globalization has given access to parts of the world and cultures that we didn't know. And they also inhabit our space, if you will. The space, as in my space and their space, has become, in fact, a lot more blurred, that distinction. It's also very important to note that languages themselves have become more transnational. They are not bound to national borders anymore. Obviously, the most obvious example is English, but so are other languages. Just this morning, we received an email asking if there was a translator who could help with an incoming refugee. So again, accordingly then, languages therefore begin to inhabit spaces that are not their cultural home. And as such, they change. When languages interact with each other, they change. And we have these interesting languages that I call port of entry languages. They are very much like airports. English, French, and German, through which the world, in fact, gets to discover each other. That doesn't mean, however, I'm going to underscore this, that doesn't mean, however, that everything that gets translated only gets translated into English, French, and German. And it doesn't also mean that, in fact, these are the only 3 languages one needs to know. You know, the one great misunderstanding about translation is that we're in the service of the native cultures, if you will. When you are reading a literary translation, our aim is to arouse your interest and curiosity and get engaged in the national cultures that have created these texts. But nonetheless, it is true that the majority of the transactions happen in these 3 languages. And then what happens, though, through these interactions is also the development of new literary vernacular, if you will, a new literary language and a new literary narrative that is much more mixed and diverse and hybrid, if you will. And in fact, today, many countries bemoan the fact that their literatures are being influenced too heavily by American culture and American literature, and especially popular culture. But quite frankly, although it's not to the same extent, there is also some reciprocal influence going on as well. I mean, I will invite you to consider how in the last 15 to 20 years, we have become a lot more attuned to certain musical tastes and certain, certain literary and visual storytelling that aren't American, but they are in fact much more Middle Eastern and Near Eastern. Now, the reason for this is not a good one, because we have been in war with these countries. But again, by the same token, the cultural exchanges that are still taking place give us great hope that there could be peaceful coexistence and mutual understanding across these differences. This is a snapshot of translation, and this is from 2000 to 2009. This table is a little difficult to read, so I will explain. So we have from these languages into these languages, right? So, for example, we have 18 Swedish texts have been translated into Chinese, okay? Now, the interesting points to observe is that the traffic is out of balance. Of the 132,000 works, 104,000 are translated from English. So only 28,000 works in 10 years are translated, in fact, across other language pairs. Now, the other interesting observation to make is if you look at into English, that column, in the 10 years tabulated here, there were 3 times as many books translated from the Swedish than there were from all the Arab-speaking countries. Only 127 titles were translated from Arab-speaking countries into English, and 359 from Swedish into English. Now, this is quite embarrassing for us, and it has sort of, if you have questions about these, we can come back to these slides, okay? Of course, what this has done is engender a concept that we have been talking about, and that's the 3% problem. Only 3% of all literary publications in English are international literary texts. So that comes to about 400 to 500 books a year that are translated from other languages into English. And so this is a 5-year cross-section. You will see here that there are about 59, 60 languages from which literature was translated into English. You will also see that, in fact, the French and Spanish and German are the most predominant numbers. And if you add them, in fact, you will see that they add to about 70% of all things published. Now, however, if you pair this with the next slide, if I can get to, hello? I cannot get to, obviously. If you look at it by country, you will see that almost 100 countries' literature have entered into the Anglo reading community. Now, this is again in the course of 5 years. Now, on one hand, we may say, well, that's so small, and I really hope that we will all work to increase the numbers. But on the other hand, if you think about how an avid reader consumes perhaps 50 to 100 books a year in reading, maybe more, there is plenty to read already. There is still plenty to read if you are interested. And it will be, in fact, only if we increase the interest before we increase the number of books that the number of books also will increase. Because this is, in fact, a marketing challenge for many, many publishing houses. Most of the books that get translated from other languages into English are published by independent publishers. And if one print run is about 1,000 copies. So we're not talking about Stephen King variety of numbers here. But nonetheless, I am actually very heartened by this because every year we have welcomed more cultures and countries and languages into our stream. And I don't see this as people should be read in English. I see this as these new languages and new cultures coming in to this port of entry where they mix and mingle. Let me give you an example. When I translated this one book by a very important Turkish author who was not known at all into English, it drew the attention of publishers in Korea and Peru, in Spain, and in sort of all sorts of places because there was an English version. So they went and, in fact, they later on translated from Turkish into their respective languages. But the port of entry is what really brings attention to these texts. And that's also why it is so important that this is like, we are moving from a regional airport to a Heathrow here, which is very good, right? So there's a lot more interaction and understanding. So, again, as I said, you know, most of the numbers you can see are in single digits. However, even 5 years back, most of these countries were not even represented. So there is hope there that we're becoming more alert to the world. So literary translation, you probably have heard time and again. One of the most commonly used compliments of a translation is that it sounds as though the author wrote it in English. That's what we sort of tend to expect from translation, that we don't want to know that it's translation. We want to feel like it's written in the translated language. And then the next thing that we see in book reviews as well as essays is, oh, it can't be as good as the original, because translation always involves what we call a ratio of loss and gain. When we translate, and I'm going to try to show you a little bit of that, when we translate something, we are trying to minimize the loss and optimize the gain. However, it is not just like the original. It's a different entity, and we have to develop a certain way of reading this, and that is different from reading just any text. And then you have what we love to call the translation police. These are the people who will pick one word out of 60,000 words in a book and say, this is not the right word to translate. And that's sort of mostly because we experience in our ordinary lives translations in terms of statements or words or sentences. And so our approach to translation and our appraisal of translation also ends up being at those very small levels. Whereas, and as I will try to show you in a minute, on the word level, virtually every translation is a failure, because it's not the same word. In fact, even if it is the very same word, they inhabit two different cultures. They are used in two different language systems. So what we try to do is balance creativity and accuracy. Every time we translate, we actually are engaging the creative fabric and machinery of the work, the creative apparatus of the work. How it is put together informs how we translate it. There are two terms that I'm sort of throwing out. One is the formal equivalence, where in fact we have word-for-word equivalence. But then there is also what is called the dynamic equivalence, where we are in fact looking at sense-for-sense translations. They are not necessarily word-for-word, but they are sense-for-sense or intent-for-intent. So the question always is, so what do you translate when you translate? What all do you translate? And I will invite you to think about the different ways in which language works in our ordinary lives as well. When somebody is uttering a word or is saying something to you, you look at their facial expression, you look at their tone, you look at their body language, you look at how loud it is or how low it is, the kind of words that they use, right? They can be, there are levels and levels of praise and admonishment, depending on what kind of words one uses. So we actually think about language in terms of 5 different levels. So how does language mean what it means? That is, how is meaning conveyed? Then how does it sound? Because again, as we know, many, many times, the meaning is conveyed through sound as well. How does it look? Remember perhaps the famous joke line of John Belushi in Saturday Night Live. He would have a very, very long sentence, and then he would go, but no, right? That sudden reversal in a short one. That's a look. That's in fact a physical, it's a physical construction that we have to also pay attention to. How does it feel? That is, how do these words evoke a certain feeling? That is the author's tone. And then how does it affect us when a text? So what we do is we try to sort of, for example, this is a very famous, very short little poem by H.T. Hilda Doolittle. And if you see, these just 6 lines actually operate on all of these levels. Yeah? Whirl up, sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. There's a visual event happening here. It is a forest being likened to a sea that is coming crashing against a cliff face and then receding. And notice the 5th line, cover us with your pools of fur. The water is receding. And where the crash is happening is on our rocks, rocks. Yeah, that's a sound, that's how it feels, that's how it looks, right? Do you see here, there is a wave, right? So all of these things contribute to our work. And then we pay attention to every high school student's nightmare, the list of literary devices and elements. How a literary work is put together is what we have to sort of disassemble and then reassemble, okay? So in this regard then, we see the interaction of languages as between host and guest. That is, when a text is being translated from French into English, English is functioning as a host language, receiving French as the guest language. Now, this is an important metaphor because oftentimes we talk about loss, gain, violation, betrayal, faithfulness, loyalty. Rather, this paradigm is talking about a much more interactive, much more dynamic relationship between two languages. So then there is also, of course, the translator. We are not neutral machines. We, in fact, are every bit involved in the process. And so here is my philosophy in one paragraph. When I translate, I traverse. Not travel, but I traverse. I go through I don't translate from the original language into the new language. Something much more fluid and literally extensive happens. I translate through the original language and through the new language, because I have to first understand how the original language is put together. The original language finds a new body in the new, while the new gains voice through the vocal cords of the original language. Translation is movement. It is a performance. It's not an object or result. Okay, so it's really much more fluid. I need to have a certain amount of competence in both of the languages, and also in both of the literary character of those languages. So I am a very active, very engaged, hopefully learned, a learned, analytical, creative agent. I am every bit part of what you are reading. So when you are reading a translation, it's okay to feel like it doesn't sound like the original. I'm always asked, do you make, because I translate into my second language from my native language, I'm always asked, do you make this author sound as if this was written in English? And I say, well, even if I tried, I can't, because I don't sound as if I speak in English. I sound at best as if I'm speaking in my second language. But the agency is very, very critical. When you are reading an author's work in partnership with the translator's efforts. So what is my goal? My goal is predicated on two things that an author I work with has said. One is that when a great work of literature emerges in a language, it means that that language has been made to express that text. That is, that language in that moment is brought to a certain level or a state of perfection in that original language. And then it says, literature is the memory of language. I'm not saying humanity, it's the memory of language. That is, every literary text is like a memory encoding in the language as it's evolving. So what I try to do is this. I try to translate particular texts and in manners that expand the capacity of English to express Turkish literature. That is, if you are to read Turkish literature, English has to be made more hospitable And that applies to every language. So English, how does it become hospitable? It is by us translating texts that sort of challenge English, if you will. And then I try to help Turkish literature to leave an imprint in the memory of English. That is, somehow, when you read a translated work from Turkish into English, it is important that you notice that something is happening to your native tongue. It's not sounding like it sounds when you hear it elsewhere, okay? So how do I do it? What does it mean? So two languages interact with one another. This is English, very basic characteristics. It has a vast vocabulary. It has the largest diction possible, that is individual words, almost 800,000 words. It's a very rational, very exacting, very well-developed grammar system it has. And it values greatly images, descriptions, objective facts, right? We're very much scientific. And it also can boast a very mature literary convention or mature literary conventions. Turkish, on the other hand, has a vocabulary that is a fourth of the size of the English. But what Turkish has is that it creates words by adding suffixes and also coinage. So it is false to assume that because Turkish does not have a discrete word that corresponds to the English word, that you cannot say that in Turkish. You can, however, it is by using, by coining, let's say, two words together. And that's how it happens in Turkish. It's also very connotative, very emotional language, Turkish. When the basic structure is the reverse structure of English. English goes subject, verb, predicate. In Turkish, verb comes at the very end of the sentence. And sometimes you don't even know what the subject of the sentence is for quite a while. So as such then, readers and listeners, and this also applies to German and French too. There are a lot of dependent clauses that are piled on these languages before you actually get to the gist of the meaning. So in situations like that, you have a different type of readership. It's not only that the languages are different, but there is also, the reader has different expectations and also different skills. A Turkish reader actually is one that is used to the deferral of meaning and enjoys, in fact, these long, ornate, elaborate wanderings, if you will, verbal wanderings. Whereas in English, this can really try your patience. You're like, well, what is this about? And so accordingly then, translating between two languages is really about putting them in relationship. There is no single technology that can apply to all language pairs. So here is an example. This is the title of, this is the book I translated. This is the last book I translated. In Turkish, it's called Uzun Sürmüş Bir Günün Akşamı. Uzun Sürmüş Bir Günün Akşamı. 5 words. And also syllable count if you want. It's Uzun Sürmüş Bir Günün Akşamı. 10. The English title is A Long Day's Evening. 5. 5 syllables and 4 words. Well, 3 words in an article, right? So already you can just say, what is going on? I mean, what is getting lost? What is getting gained? So let me show you the gymnastics that this involves. So the title, word for word, if you analyze it, goes like long lasted one of day evening, which really means prolonged a day's evening, So it's a little bit like a prolonged day's evening, which would get you no readership in English because it doesn't read like English. It reads, in fact, very much like translationese. If you analyze the vowels, there is a vowel harmony in Turkish. That's very important. You will see that it goes something like u, al. So it's in fact soft vowels and hard hard vowels. And then notice that the consonants also can be grouped, and there are repetitions in the consonants. So sound-wise, this title goes from slow movement from day to evening. It evokes a sense of postponement and prolongation and deferral. It also evokes a reversal, some kind of a disappointment, because you have this long day that is prolonged, but it ends not in night, but it ends in evening, which is this liminal time, right? You don't know if night will ever come. So I tried different titles, and these are only few of the many I tried. In fact, some early publicity things, if you find on the internet, you will see that I had other titles that I was very seriously considering. Then so what I'm doing here is you can move the text closer to the reader, or you can move it back to the original meaning. So I could have, in fact, done away with the title entirely and come up with a title that may be very attractive and intriguing to the American readership. That the book is about Byzantine monks. It's about Eastern Orthodoxy. It has a mosaic of Jesus. So I could have put here icon or icon, right? It could have worked, except that it would be too closely aligning yourself with the reader. So what happened is that it occurred to me that this title, in fact, is very close to a very celebrated title in English, A Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. And in fact, if you were to translate A Long Day's Journey into Night into Turkish, it would be something like uzun sürmüş bir günün geceye serüveni. Notice, uzun sürmüş bir günün are identical. Gece is night, akşam is evening, and serüven is journey. So I said, And Karasu translated from 7 different languages, including English, and was very well read in the Anglo literature. And there is every reason to believe that Karasu knew this book, this play. And in fact, his work also is about crisis of faith, which also is the subject of A Long Day's Journey into Night. So I said, how about I say A Long Day's Evening? By just keeping this part, uzun sürmüş bir günün, a long days, I am sort of sending to the American reader a hint of the Eugene O'Neill title. And in fact, if you are familiar with Eugene O'Neill's title and you see this, you will make that association, or at least I hope you will make that association. And the other interesting thing is, this is how Eugene O'Neill's title was translated into Turkish. Much shorter, günden geceye, which means from day to night. It sort of destroys everything. So I thought that by doing this, I'm sort of almost recovering something that gets lost. So very quickly, I want to also show you, we're not going to read the whole thing, but I want to sort of show you, this is how a Turkish text looks. And there are 183 words here in this segment. This is how it looks in English. The word count is 269, about 86 additional words. Now, partly because, as we were talking about, in Turkish, words are agglutinated. You can create extended word forms that actually sometimes mean an entire sentence in English. But notice that when one is translating, and this is not only a case with English and Turkish, German and English have the same kind of challenges. The word count is very different in the two. But then what we try to do then is not necessarily count the words, but count the beats. I'm going to show you what happens in the section that is the blue. Let me just read this one because it's a lovely, beautiful passage. Something is born, it grows out of the air's softness. When he started his walk, there was sunlight, but also a cool breeze beginning to make itself felt. Now, after walking for some time, after experiencing the light drunkenness of exhaustion in his joints, his flesh, after bearing all the burden of exertion in his arms, his legs, he isn't surprised that a wave of heat begins to seep through his skin to the interior of his body. The inner chill shooting outward like crackling sparks is also a sensation he has known for a long time. But as the sun retreats behind Mount Aventius, the shadows deepen along the path he's been walking. The rustling grows louder, sharper, among the leaves, among the branches, somewhat sparse yet still green, in the woods ahead of him as the soft, diffuse lights swell, then redoubles. Light, there is a typo there, as the soft, diffuse light swells, then redoubles. So, how a text like this gets constructed. So these are the words in Turkish. I'll begin with them. Yeah. Okay, oops. So if you look at word for word, which really, again, it doesn't mean at all anything. Now he walked, his flesh, his joints, light, exhaustion, drunkenness, way upon, starting to da-da-da-da-da, right? Then this version that I have here is the first legible version. This is sort of in standard English of some form. Now because he walked, because his flesh and his joints began feeling the light drunkenness of exhaustion, because he bore the burden of all his exertion on his legs and arms, and so on and so forth, okay? So now notice here, you have katmerleşiyor, kabarıyor, two words, grows, dense, and swells, right? So you notice, therefore, where the crowding is happening. English is just, has a greater vocabulary. So now, what I did here is, I took each sentence of the section, and I put first the Turkish, then the first translation, and then the translation as it appears in the published version. And I did this with both sentences. So we're talking about two sentences. The reason why I wanted to break it like this is to show you that even though word count-wise, English is more verbose, in terms of the length, notice how they have become so much closer to each other. This is the Turkish, and this is the English. There too, this is the Turkish, and that's the English that got published, right? So, and you can see it's almost like line lengths are almost identical, almost. It's not perfect. But what I'm trying to get at here is that when you are reading a book that is translated and something feels strange, you're actually getting a flavor of the creative effort that goes into it. And that's also why I think we need to be able to read translation looking for a different kind of appreciation, looking for a different kind of taste, and not just the original. You will notice that and you know, this book took me about 4 years to complete in the translation. It's a very dense text, and every sentence, you know, in English, our sentences usually run 20 to 40 words, and 40 is too long, in fact. If you can put the dependent clauses in a very orderly fashion, we will read it. But if you do something that the Turkish or the German or the Portuguese or the Spanish like to do, which is take you on a sort of almost a psychological journey through the language, that does not translate very well. And so we have to somehow find equivalencies. Let me then stop here and let me see if I can answer any questions that my comments may have provoked. Yes?
So, what is the the method that you're using to work through the versions? Like, are you scanning the original text into your computer and breaking it out in English and then a second English on your computer, or in separate documents? How do you manage a book like this?
Well,
You know what I'm asking?
yes, yes. Well, one of the things that working with computers has done is it has made us lose our footsteps. Because often we compose and we go through several drafts on the computer, and most of those drafts get lost. We don't preserve them. And this has become very much a problem for me, because I realize the more I lose drafts, the more I am losing potential techniques, right? If there is a problem that I worked it out in one way, the technique I need to remember, because the same problem will come somewhere else. So what I try to do now is pay more attention to the drafts and create, and it's still pretty difficult, because again, especially when translating prose, you're talking about very large units of writing. But there are parts in a text, there are parts that particularly require effort. And those are the parts where I preserve the multiple drafts. So what it is, yes, I do have the original scanned. I have a big screen monitor. Half of it is dedicated to the original and the other half to the translation. But then I have a third piece, which is my workshop, if you will, or my work table, if you will. So I open, and at one point, in fact, on my screen, you could have 3 or 4 such documents where I am triangulating, if you will, and trying to see how best to put it together. Now, let's not exaggerate. This is not what one does with every sentence. But there are, in fact, segments of a book that really rise to a very high occasion, and you have to rise to that occasion yourself. So there is a technique, or not a technique, but a habit. Different people do it differently. I like to be attentive to my translations every step of the way. There are translators who will produce a first draft and then a second draft. I don't. I produce a first sentence, second sentence, third sentence. I go very slowly. Anything else? Yes?
How do you know when you're done?
You never are. You know, that's interesting. Well, you know, the text,
Sherman when you're done.
yeah. I mean, every translation is sort of a reading of a text. And so if I have done my work as a reader and I understood that sentence for what I think it is worth, you know, it's sound, it's this, it's that, then I sort of decide which of these are absolutely most fundamental about this sentence. Then I have to work until I have recreated everything I saw in that sentence. And so now I may feel done, and you can read it, and if you have seen something else in the original and it's not there, then you translate it also. I mean, that's sort of how many, many texts get retranslated. You know, like there are easily 50 plus versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. There are about 40 versions of the Bible. You know, so again, it's about deciding what that sentence means and then making every effort to create equal values in the English. But you're never done. I in fact corrected this just yesterday. I was like, you know, there is a light drunkenness of exhaustion. I thought, maybe I should have said experiencing drunk exhaustion. It could be done, and you know, because I was very keen on getting the beats to be the same amount, and this is still longer. So it bugs me that it's still longer in terms of beat count. There are more beats there than there are there. So I suppose we're never done.
Could you give us a quick travelogue of how this book traveled from the writer to you translating the first sentence?
Yes, well, that's a wonderful question. If you are not translating from one of the top 6 or 7 languages where translation happens, French, German, Russian, Italian, Spanish, English, if you're translating from any other languages, often you are the most educated person about that text. So I actually introduce the author to an American audience or to an American publisher who has very little understanding of Turkish literature, who has never heard of this author, or who has heard of this author, but just like a friend of a friend type of and is not actively seeking to publish a translation. So there's a great deal of publicity and promotion that I have to do. One of my advantages is my complete background, and because I have an academic training in literature, I can actually present a text's importance. So I write a report. But here is how my journey began with Bilge Karasu, because this is really very interesting too. I wanted to translate Bilge Karasu, and I wrote to the publisher in Turkey, and I said, can I please translate Bilge Karasu? And she said, oh, what an interesting coincidence. Grand Street in New York is interested in translating some Karasu. Why don't you contact them? So Jean Stein, who is really like a Duchess of American Letters, editor of Grand Street. It was a beautiful magazine, but it went bankrupt because it was so beautiful. It really was very expensive. So I talked to her, and she said, you know, we received these essays. We want to publish one of them, but of course we don't know Turkish. Can you read and send us reports? So I read, and as I'm writing the reports, I called her back and I said, do you want me to also tell you which one I think may work? They said, oh yes, by all means. So I said, this one does this little post-structuralist, trick and so on and so forth. And then as I'm sending, I said, if I were to translate, I would like to translate this one. So the phone rings this time. Would you please translate this? But do you notice? I mean, all throughout, I am actually the one making the decisions. The only thing that the editor had was an interest, an enthusiasm to introduce Turkish literature, which really already put her in a category all to herself, because that wasn't there either. Like you notice in the last 5 years, only 25 works from Turkish were published, books. So that comes to, and there were a couple years where the numbers were like 8. So there were years that only 3 books were published from Turkish. So the journey is a lot of promoting. And then you win over somebody, either with what you have written or what they have heard from others, and they give it a try. And once they give it a try and some critical buzz is generated, then like the publisher that I work with, City Lights, Elaine Katzenberger, in fact, after she published a Karasu piece, said, I'm going to go to Turkey and look for other works. So she did. Just what they do, if it is Danish or Swedish, they go and look. So that's how it happened. Any other questions? Yes?
You were talking about how different languages have different styles to them. I'm wondering, you had the page of the Turkish and the English. I'm wondering if, let's say in Turkish there's a certain style that produces a certain effects to the Turkish. If you translate that style into English and it produces a different effect,
Does.
do you preserve the style, or do you try to use a different style that produces the same effect of the original?
Remember, that's a very good question, because again, you're going back to what that statement said, right? For a text to be produced in a language, that language has to be made to express that text. So every great piece of literature is in fact some kind of a culmination point in the history of that language. So you are absolutely right that when you are taking a text that has accomplished something like that in Turkish, it is not always possible to make it accomplish the same in English. And in fact, it is not always advisable that it should. What do I mean? Because, for example, there are different cultures that are in different points in their literary evolution. So what is revolutionary, if you will, in one language may actually be old hat in another language. Or the other way around. It may be too alien. Let me give you an example from Kafka. We all know Franz Kafka, great, incredibly important author. And he was translated by Edwin and Willa Muir, a couple. And they actually created a certain style for Kafka in English that got the English readership interested in Kafka. However, 30 years later, another translator, thanks to scholarship that was done about the original manuscripts of Kafka, was able to retranslate Kafka, this time paying more attention to those peculiarities of the original that Edwin and Willa Muir deliberately played down. And in fact, this second translator, Mark Harmon, says, Had I translated Kafka the way I translate now, had I translated it back in the time of the Mewers, nobody would have wanted to read Kafka. So in a way, what we do is also, we do with a sense of a longer history. You know, the hope is that we make these texts available to the best of our abilities, and knowing that some things are getting lost, but also thinking that later attempts at translation will rectify those losses. But you're absolutely right. You are not reading exactly the original. In fact, sometimes you would not be able to read it if the original were translated exactly in the spirit and the sort of linguistic radical language that it was produced in. Okay? I mean, it's the same with every literature. There are some great texts that we want to translate, and there are some texts that are produced for public consumption. And the great texts are almost always those that make something happen to the native language. And so it becomes a particular challenge. Well, that's it. Please go and buy international literature and read. That's what we want you to do. Thank you. Thanks.
Aron is going to be at an event on
Oh, yes, Saturday.
from 3 to 5 at the Mill, called Translation Without Borders.
Theater Without Borders.
Theater, excuse me,
Yeah.
Theater Without Borders, maybe.
Yeah, we are going to read excerpts from 3 international plays, and then have a panel with the participation of the translators and 2 of the playwrights. So one is an Armenian play, another is a Turkish play, and then the third one is a US play, but it uses a lot of Brazilian folktale material, folklore. So we're trying to infiltrate. All right, thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.